Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christopher Bailey of the World Health Organization. I'm the Arts and Health Lead based here in Geneva, and you're joining the conversation called Visions and Voices of a Healthy Planet. This is part of a larger celebration of World Health Day this year with WHO called Our Planet, Our Health, about the existential crisis of making our planet more sustainable, more livable for humanity, for all life forms, but also the many other health consequences of man's interference with a healthy ecosystem. This particular conversation, however, is about artists. It's also artists are the group that often in any crisis are the first to arrive to sound the alarm, to offer a perspective, to offer hope and comfort and a way forward. They seem to always be on the front lines of the most important issues. But there's another dimension to this conversation that I think will become very quickly apparent. And that's not just the messaging that artists do, but the actual healing that engagement in the arts can do. And particularly in this context, nature itself has a healing quality, and artists often are the medium to help access this wonderful power. So before we get into the conversation, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Nisha Sajnani from New York University, who's been my colleague on all these healing arts events that we have planned. Nisha, tell us a little bit more about the conversation we're about to hear.
Terrific, and thank you. It's a pleasure to co-host this event with you, Chris, and to be in conversation with all of you about the role of the arts in promoting a reciprocal relationship between planetary and human health, and directly addressing the biggest challenge of our time. I direct a graduate program in drama therapy and an initiative called Arts and Health at NYU, which seeks to advance policy, practice, and research on the benefits of the arts in physical, mental, social, public, and environmental health. And I will just say personally, I have turned to painting and theater and direct engagement in nature, of course, to keep me literally grounded and to work through the enormity of climate change and my own grief and concern about what we're witnessing. Before I introduce all of our guests today, I'm going to begin by inviting my colleague, Cecil Scheib, Chief Sustainability Officer for New York University, to offer a few words of welcome. Cecil.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much, Nisha. So I come to you today with some good news. It seems that people are recognizing the problem we're facing. Our days of just trying to explain there's a problem are over. Our youth are in their streets. They're literally fighting for their future, and they give me hope. But I have some bad news too. We're all confronting climate anxiety, climate despair, the feeling that now we know there's a problem, but we're powerless to change it. So how can we address this climate despair? How can we move forward towards real solutions and change? Well, as a lifelong musician and a professional engineer, I believe that our being able to confront climate change, it's not essentially a technical problem. It's a cultural change problem. It's a social change problem. We have the tools we need. The issue is getting us to have the courage to actually use them to make change. And you know who I'm going to say is the best at getting people to change and to think and to engage. It's artists, of course. So there's this huge overlap between global health and art. There's lots of common ground. So what is our message? Is what we've done in the past working? Is a guilt-based message working? Is a fear-based message working? Are movies of polar bears swimming from ice floe to ice floe? Has that brought about the type of change we've been looking for? Not necessarily. Maybe we need some new messages. What are some examples? Well, people spend 90% or more of their time indoors. And that seems like a crazy idea, but how many days are you outside more than 2.5 hours a day? It's really not that common. But also, so much of our climate pollution comes from our buildings, building them, the energy used when we're inside them, how we get to them. And so the things that we do in buildings that reduce our cognitive function, right? Like poor air quality, stuffy air, overheating, overcooling, drafts. These cause people poor health and discomfort. They're not happy in their buildings, but they're also, all of those things are energy waste that are causing carbon pollution. So we can make better and healthier buildings that support our cognitive function, but that also help save the climate. I'll give another example, our diets. People eat foods, as we know, that are so often not healthy for them, but animal-based foods have 60 to 70 times the climate impact of a plant-based diet. That would also be much healthier for many people. There's a chance to fix two things at once here. So on that message, I was just listening to Bryant Terry, who's an NYU grad and a famed Black vegan chef. He's touched so many lives. His origin story, he was inspired by a hip hop song. So you see how this comes full circle, right? The arts inspired him. He got into cooking, he got into food, he got into diets. Now he's talking to other people. So I love my work here at NYU because we are so strong in the humanities and the arts, but also in economics and business, climate science. All these things can really come together, but also in our own actions. We really try to walk the walk. We have reduced the climate pollution from our own buildings. That's the equivalent of planting all of Manhattan and all of Brooklyn in trees just by ourselves. We're going to be climate neutral by 2040, and we have a plan to reduce our emissions from food specifically, which is so important, 25% by the year 2030. So we're showing it's possible, and by doing so, we're helping people confront their own climate despair, as are all of you. So I can't wait to get this conversation started.
Thank you so much, Cecil. I've learned something new there as well about our own university. And I'm very, very excited to hear about the work that all of you have been doing, which we know just a little bit of. I have the pleasure of introducing all of you. And I'll begin with Renée Fleming, who's a 4-time Grammy Award-winning American soprano and a recipient of the National Medal of the Arts. Her latest album is entitled Voices of Nature, the Anthropocene, a collaboration with Canadian conductor and pianist Yannick Nézet-Séguin, which highlights the peril and fragility of the natural world today. Dr. Melissa Lem is a Vancouver-based family physician who also works in rural and remote communities across Canada. Dr. Lem is the president-elect of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and director of Parks Prescriptions for the BC Parks Foundation. She's also a clinical assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, another place I'm happy to call home. Modisana Mabale is an award-winning independent theater maker, street performer, writer, and facilitator who believes that African Indigenous knowledge can help us explore solutions for our planet. He is the director of Street Arts Government based in Sharpeville, South Africa, and is passionate about engaging children in environmental stewardship. Jave Yoshimoto was born in Japan to Chinese parents and later immigrated to the US. He's an award-winning and widely published painter who has received recognition from the United Nations for his works and is also on faculty at the University of Nebraska, where he teaches studio arts courses. And finally, Chantal Bilodeau joins us from Alaska today. Chantal is a playwright, translator, and artistic director of the Arts and Climate Initiative and curator of HowlRound Theater Commons series, Theater in the Age of Climate Change. Much of her work has focused on the social and environmental impacts of the climate crisis on 8 Arctic states. Thank you all for making the time to be in conversation. So Chris, I'm going to pass this over to you for our first question.
Well, thanks, Nisha, and welcome, Renée, for the first part of our conversation. Now, Renée and I met not through her fantastic artistry and singing, but actually through her advocacy for the health benefits of the arts, as well as being an advocate for exploring the science behind it, why this actually happens. And we were on a panel together at a symposium, Healing Arts Symposium at the Metropolitan Museum of Art last November. And a number of people out there, colleagues, friends of mine, so enjoyed that panel and that discussion that for Christmas, I was given several copies of her latest CD, Voices of Nature, the Anthropocene. And when I listened to it, I was struck by so many different things that now I have the opportunity to ask about to Renée directly. Renée, what was your inspiration for this CD?
Thank you, Chris. Well, like any and so many people during the pandemic, I took solace in not only actually being grounded. So many of us in the performing arts weren't working. It really hit us hard. But also the political discord that exists in our country, which was distressing to me. You know, we were talking a lot about despair and how many people were feeling such tremendous despair during the pandemic and still are. And my walking outside, as Cecil wisely said, really was a very healing force in that period of time for me. In fact, I didn't want to be indoors at all. I just wanted to be outside, you know, gardening, walking, tree hugging, whatever we call it. So I had always actually noticed that in 19th century repertoire, which is poetry based for the most part, you know, the song literature, because so many songs were actually invented for performance in people's parlors and living rooms, was heavily influenced by nature. In fact, every human emotion, every human experience was framed by poets in nature. And I thought this is no longer really the case for the reason that Cecil said, we're indoors now. So much of the time we don't have, my whole life has been in urban centers because that's where opera houses are. So I missed that. And the idea to create a recording that kind of juxtaposed those two worlds and those two periods and times was interesting to me. Both the beautiful romantic song literature and also the commissioning new works, in fact, by Kevin Putz, who won a Pulitzer Prize, Nico Muhly, Caroline Shaw, we performed a piece with her, and Robinson Meyer, who's a staff writer for The Atlantic and then has the newsletter, The Weekly Planet, who's really a climate expert, was involved because we used some of his words in one of the pieces. And then ultimately, I thought, how can we reach more people? So we've recorded Jackson Browne's Before the Deluge, which the words are extraordinary. It was created a long time ago for this frightening period in which we feared a nuclear attack during the Cold War. And unfortunately, we're sort of back in that place again, shockingly. And so the words have a kind of a double meaning. They apply beautifully to climate issues that we face and also to this fear again that we are experiencing right now. So artists in my early time as an artist were not really encouraged in my world to have public ideas, to share public ideas, to advocate. You know, advocacy was not particularly encouraged. You were supposed to be surrounded by a whole coterie of managers, handlers, publicists, and your job was really to be the hothouse flower who could perform, you know, extremely well on stage. That's completely changed because artists are now mostly self-managed to a great degree. We are actually encouraged to have ideas because that's what interests people in addition to the art that we create. So it's a wonderful opportunity, I think, for people now to be interested, to advocate for things that they care about. And so that's what I'm definitely doing right now. And frankly, the audience loves it. They can come to experience something beautiful, but also learn something. So, and climate for me is number one. Nothing else really matters if we can't save the planet.
Yeah, well, certainly it adds multiple dimensions of connection and empathy when it's not just artistry for its own sake, but something that everyone can relate to and feel a sense of urgency about. When I heard that single, Before the Deluge, you were performing with a couple of other marvelous artists, Alison Krauss and Rhiannon Giddens. I mean, you'll be disappointed in me as a professional singer for saying this, but when I was listening to it halfway through, I realized I forgot to breathe. I was so entranced by the sound. I literally had to catch my breath. So I violated the first rule of professional singers, but it was a transporting sound. And what you said earlier about 19th century music and poets, I think is no accident. In the UK in particular, after the Enclosure Acts, there was a huge demographic change of people being thrown off their land after generations and rural populations moving into the cities at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the upheaval that caused, the disconnection from the land, the disconnection from family and social structures. And I think the Romantic poets in some ways were responding to that, and it was a harbinger of what we're seeing happening today. It's really, so I think your thoughts on that are absolutely on point. But another thing that I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll go to the other panelists, is, and maybe it's just my visual impairment, but when I was listening to Voice of Nature, I've listened to a lot of soloists with a piano accompanist, and oftentimes, by definition, the piano kind of takes a back seat and is just supporting the singer. And in this recording, I could swear it sounded almost like a call and response, almost like a duet. And was that intentional?
Well, the pianist, Yannick Nézet-Séguin, is also the music director of the Metropolitan Opera and the Philadelphia Orchestra. So he is on the top of our sort of our world right now. And he cares also very deeply about this. So yes, there's no question. I mean, in its best performance, we should be equal partners. There is no accompanying in song literature and recital. The art of the recital is two equal partners and making music together. I mean, we're tending to stare at the audience, so we sometimes and wear extravagant outfits, but that sometimes gets more attention. But I agree with you. It's a call and response is a really great idea in terms of talking about it.
I think that's important for what we're talking about today, because what we're really talking about is reconnecting to ourselves, to each other, and to the world around us. And that CD at a fundamental level is a practical example of how we can do that through sound, through shared emotion and communication. And I think about the poetry of Wordsworth. I think about, Faulkner's The Bear. I think about indigenous communities all over the world that have had these intimate relationships with nature, going on the vision quest into the landscape to find themselves, to reconnect, and to do that often through song, through words. There was a book by Bruce Chatwin on the indigenous peoples in Western Australia, and he asked them why they go on these long treks into the wilderness and sing these epic songs. And the answer surprised him. This particular person said to him, they do it to sing the world into existence, which I thought was a wonderful idea. But it's this notion, I think, of it's not just about saving the planet, it's that nature has always healed us. And when we lost that intimate connection, both the planet and ourselves became less healthy.
Oh, that's beautifully put. I love that notion. And the other thing I can say about being an artist too, is that we have an audience, we have fans, and we're reaching them every time we say something or do something. And that's why it's become so helpful. Now, for me, I'm a fan now of the writer Richard Powers because of The Overstory. The Overstory just awakened my fascination with our tree life, and exactly what you said, kind of the history of our relationship to nature, and the potential, the hope that we could resolve this and solve this.
Yeah, I think the role of the artist as the mediator when needed between nature and the public, and through that forming a sense of community, as any artist around the world does. Opera is one genre, but any of the genres, to me, if done well, they're all the same, So Nisha, maybe that's a nice segue to bring in our next guest.
Absolutely. I'm thinking specifically of Dr. Melissa Lem and restoring the relationship to nature. And Melissa, can I pass this to you to speak about, you've been leading this effort to prescribe nature in Canada, to restore our relationship to the land, to rediscover and to acknowledge and act on the health benefits of nature itself. I'll pass this over to you to tell us a bit about what you've been doing.
Well, this happened just over a year ago, maybe about a year and a half ago. We launched nature prescriptions within Canada. So here in Canada, we call it PARX. I think elsewhere in the world, it's known as Park Prescriptions in the US, ParkRx America, but it's Canada's national nature prescription program. We launched in British Columbia, where I'm fortunate to live, and then have spread out across the country. And in the last month or so, it's actually a phenomenon that the world has taken notice of, because we announced a partnership with our national parks agency, Parks Canada, where physicians and other health professionals now registered with our program can prescribe free park passes to reduce the barrier, for example, of cost to access nature for some of our patients. And what we really want to do is make nature that fourth pillar of health. So along with healthy diet, healthy sleep and exercise, every time one of my colleagues counsels a patient about the things they should be doing with their lifestyle to improve their health, nature time should be one of them. And it's been really interesting for me to listen to what you've had to say, Renee, and what you've said, Christopher, about art being the intermediary between us and nature, because in many ways, physicians and other health professionals also are the intermediary for patients and other things that will make them healthy, like art. I know through my training and my career, I would say that connecting to nature and actually experiences in music in particular have been what have grounded me. I know during the pandemic, I have a piano in my home. Often if I have a stressful day, I'll go to my piano or I'll go outside or both at the same time. I think it's really important for us to connect to that more than human world, whether it's art or whether it's nature, to give our brains a break and really help build that resilience that helps us get through tough times like we're experiencing now.
And could you speak a bit about what are the health benefits of being in nature?
I think the better question is, what aren't the health benefits of being in nature? There really isn't any medical condition that nature doesn't make better. So if you think about mental health, there are studies that show from children's development to elderly people who are near the end of life, nature can improve anxiety and depression. It helps us focus better. It reduces symptoms of ADHD, and having experiences of awe, which I think we can experience both in the more than human world and when we connect to art, that has been shown in research as well to improve our mental health. And then when it comes to physical health, I mean, from the prenatal periods and birth outcomes to better eyesight in children who spend more time outside, to reduced hypertension and diabetes, even improved cholesterol and cancer care outcomes. Again, like I said, there's almost no condition that spending time in and around nature doesn't improve.
Thank you so much for that. And now I'm thinking about children and how, Modisana, you have been really focused on encouraging children's connection to nature, starting at an early age, especially in a time when we are, indoors for, far more often. In your context in Sharpeville, South Africa, can you tell us about how you have been encouraging children to engage in environmental stewardship?
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Modisana, and I'm from Sharpeville in South Africa. So my engagement with the environment started when we were encountering a problem of illegal dumping around, and we are also surrounded by landfill sites whereby there's a lot of waste burning around. So most of these pollutions again are community induced. So as street arts government, we came up with a concept whereby the reason we call ourselves street arts government is to take the arts to the streets and have a self-governing method that we apply, and to encourage community members to have sense of ownership in public spaces. So what we did was we established Theatre of the Oppressed. Most of our works are inspired by Theatre of the Oppressed by Augusto Boal and Richard Schechner on performance, the environmental theatre. And we sort of started identifying spaces that are problematic in the communities, like those dumping sites. And we use those spaces to sort of engage with the community, because most of the programs that the government came with are more didactic So what we conceptualized as street arts government was to come up with ways of distancing so that we can identify common metaphors in the community. So for example, we used plastics that we find in the dumping sites. We found some costumes in the, so that some of the props that we used to create stories so that the community can be part of changing narratives instead of us imposing how the solutions should be. And one of the things that we did in those dumping sites, we created invisible theater as inspired by Augusto Boal. It was whereby we staged a scenario in the dumping site and we sort of had a picnic in the dumping site. So that method allowed community members to engage with us in the space, because it was awkward for them to notice such events happening in the dump site. That's when we started engaging and hearing their stories based on these dumping sites. And I was glad to see that community members started taking actions and they transformed the dumping site into a recreational park. So in moving forward, we started engaging children in the spaces to tell stories about plants, because of I'm one person who got healed by nature. I was going through mental health issues, and some of these plants helped me to deal with my situation. So now we sort of started staging performances in these awkward spaces, because the theater to us is not limited to space. Any public space is a space for performance. So that's where we started doing forum theater and engaging community members, because our stories can help us form a community. Hence, I say Augusto Boal inspired the concepts that we use in telling stories about our environment.
And
So
you have an eco theater campaign happening now, if I understand correctly, Modisana, or maybe it just ended, the Garden of Stories involving children. Is this the one you were just speaking about, or is this a new campaign?
yes, that campaign, actually, the concept came after we noticed that people were engaging in the dump site. So now it's about them understanding the stories that come with nature, because most of us have memories about certain plants. We have indigenous, like for example, indigenous knowledge about these plants. So we sort of trying to engage them in the spaces to tell their family stories based on plants. So for example, there's a group of children who have stories about spinach. So they were telling us interesting stories about the spinach, how it reminds them of their grandparents. So we sort of use a distancing method in order to engage them in understanding that nature can heal. But hearing each other's stories, it helps them to participate. And also, as we are playing, we also use play. And because now if we become too didactic, then children begin to disengage. So some of the methods that we still experimenting, but we have noticed that when we play, that's when children start to engage. So yeah, that's what we are doing. And we're also using puppetry in that to tell stories about plants and the whole ecosystem, because nature works in mysterious ways, so there's sort of cooperation within nature and animals as well.
Modisana, your story is just fantastic. And just for our audience who may not be familiar with Augusto Boal, just one of the main differences between the approach inspired by him and normal development communication is that it's not about an organization or a government telling the people what to think or how to feel. It's handing the microphone to the children, to the community, as you've described, and they become the author of their own narrative, the issues that are most important to them, and you are just the mediator in a sense. Am I right?
Yes, yes, you are right, because in a traditional theater, you have the audience just being recipients of what the performers are giving. But with Augusto Boal, they become spec actors. So they not just only become spectators, but they become participants in the narratives that we are telling. So it's about us working as a community, both performers and people who are observing. So hence I'm saying Augusto Boal's method is interesting because it allows the community to have a say in the stories and even changing the narratives that of our communities. Yes.
And I'm thinking, Modisana, there was you had told me a little bit about an outcome that you had where your invisible theater work in an area of illegal dumping actually resulted in the community engaging in a full cleanup act. So there was a tangible outcome to this work.
Yes, yes. So yeah, because with the process, it was a matter of saying to community members, if we have sense of ownership, so ownership of stories and ownership of tangible outcomes, because most people were sharing their stories. I remember they were telling us that they used to dump other objects there. So sort of when hearing their stories, they were sort of motivated to take action, because as performers, we were telling them that we are not in charge, you are in charge. This is your story. We can't tell you how to tell your story. You have your individual story that relates to the environment itself. So telling us your story matters. Whether you are an individual or you are a child or an adult, your story matters in the process. So tell us your story and then let us use the story to go forward.
Thank you, Modisana. I'm thinking now of stories of garlic for some reason, and I'm going to sit with that after the conversation today. But I'm sure that if each of us were to think about a plant, that were to think about the stories connected to the foods that we eat, there would be many stories to tell. And maybe that might be an invitation to do so next time we're around the table with friends and family. But I'm going to pick up on something else you said, Modisana, as a means of making a bridge to your work, Jave, specifically around the arts and mental health, although I know your work it expands beyond that, because you've taken up themes of climate change and global crises in your visual arts work. But I'm wondering if you can comment on the impact of your practice personally, professionally, in the communities that you engage in, if you see any connections to mental health and beyond.
Sure. I'm Jave Yoshimoto. I am a visual artist based in the Midwest in Omaha, Nebraska. Through my art career, I have training in art therapy and in visual arts. And what I've learned is that the journey of art making itself is very healing on its own. And there's a lot of way to understand what we observe in the world as we make and through that process, heal from whatever it is we're witnessing. So for example, as I've been traveling and seeing different issues around the country and the world, I become traumatized from that process. And so by making paintings or sculptures about those subject matters, allows me to kind of process that information, but also it becomes this bridge to have communication with other people. And for me, it's important for me to make works that are more accessible to the public as opposed to just the art audience, because I think it's a much bigger issue than just specific language in the arts world. So I would sometimes show my work in a non-traditional art space, like say in a public library or outdoor space or etc., that allows the general public to engage the works. And the most important thing for me is to have them be engaged in ways that they are coming to their own understanding of the message in the works. So I don't like to give it away, if that makes sense. A perfect painting is something that nobody can solve, or rather something that the audience can come in and then come to their own conclusion and be engaged and have a conversation about it. One of the most interesting responses I've had is one person told me, I like that your work is making me think. I don't like that what it's making me think about, but it allowed him to think about the big issues at hand that he himself could engage in. So it's really a bridge for me to raise Brown, not just to process the trauma that I experienced from witnessing some of the big things around the world, but also really engage in a very one-on-one basis with the audience members. Sometimes I will receive personal notes, emails, conversations when they come up to me at the receptions. So it's been a very intimate conversations that I've had. Not everybody comes away with the same message. Not everyone comes away with a positive message per se, but it does allow them to pause and to really think outside of their own mind, to really think about what it is that they should be concerned about. And it's really a very personal engagement. And that's what I really enjoy about my process.
That the arts give us pause to notice what we are noticing, to reconsider our relationship to the issues that you portray, even if it is uncomfortable. And I know, Chantal, you have quite a bit of experience with this in leading the Arts and Climate Change Initiative. And I wonder if you can pick up on, the thread of conversation around the impact on the audience that several of our panelists have brought forward already. What have you noticed the impacts to be? If you could tell us a bit about the work that you've been engaged in, and I know it spans years, but what have the impacts been?
Yeah, so I would say the climate anxiety was mentioned several times in this conversation, and how difficult it is for us to deal with the fact that this thing is happening and we seem to be powerless to change it. And so a lot of what we try to do is to help people move through grief and then find a sense of hope. So the story of the climate crisis, as it is portrayed in the media, is a story of failure, the story of not acting, and it's a story of disasters and policy failure and all of that. And while all of that is true, and it is happening, and we have to recognize it, it's not the whole story. Like, we're leaving out the part that can actually help us move forward by seeing, oh, this is happening and this is being successful and there's a lot of effort there. And so we in our work, we try to bring some of that to help people be motivated, and also a lot because theater brings people together in a room, usually when it's not COVID. And because it's very local, it's about people will often comment that they are surprised that there are that many people in their neighborhood, in their community, that feel the way they do. Like, oh, I didn't know, that people had these same values, had the same concerns. And so we bring people together. They feel less alone in their efforts to make a change. And then they're encouraged to connect with other people and take something and try to change it.
That's already a different narrative arc. Everyone should know Chantal wrote this brilliant essay called "Why I'm Breaking Up with Aristotle." Chantal, I'm attributing that correctly, right?
Yes.
The narrative arc of the hero who sets out, meets an obstacle, is faced with that obstacle, ultimately might, be met with some failure, or maybe there's a chance of a positive outcome, a heroic outcome, who knows? But it's the story of one meeting an obstacle, and then there's a denouement, and the story ends. Whereas the story you just told us, Chantal, is of confronting an obstacle and then really sitting with what can we do together. It's a different story.
Yeah, and it's not a story of conquest, which is essentially what the traditional narrative structure is. And it's the conquest, like one person going after something and everybody is either against them or trying to support their vision. And in my own work, and I think in the work that I facilitate, I try to encourage a coming together of different perspectives. So it's not just one quest, but it's like different views that don't necessarily always fit together very well, but we have to find a way to accommodate all of these views because they're all important.
Mm-hmm. How do we accommodate the many views around this issue? And I'm going to open that up to everyone here for comments on what you're hearing.
Well, I would love to just, I'm loving this. You're all doing such important work, and it's incredibly inspiring to me. I guess my comment is, I always feel in the things that I do that it's wonderful to create alliances. And, you know, Chantal, you're talking about collaboration as opposed to, you know, the story of one. And I'm curious to know if NYU is creating a consortium of other universities who are also engaged in this type of network of students who can really truly affect change. I mean, I see my children. I'm so hopeful about the next generation saying, okay, enough of this. And I just pray that they stay on that track and don't lose heart. So I'm just wondering if there are kind of groups that are doing this on a larger basis in terms of universities.
Yeah, we're doing a couple things at NYU. We're part of something called the International Universities Climate Alliance that works on messaging for leaders and various decision makers using science to make good policy decision. But also NYU students are part of the Sunrise Movement. And there's a Sunrise chapter here at NYU, and there's a lot of going back, you know, and forth there. And I think just going back to the arts, I mean, it is great for students to hear that, and sort of, you know, what you know, Chantal said about the media and the message we hear, and what when people write a good story in the media is like very simple, one message, the entire thing's in the first line, and it's clickbait. Whereas arts are a place where, like, you can be left with ambiguity. There can be a couple things true at the same time. And what do they say about intelligence is the ability to hold two conflicting views in your head at the same time, or something like that. People need that from the arts because we are not getting it from tweets.
Thank you. And I also wonder, for policy changes, and especially in our system that rewards politicians with huge sums of money from lobbyists, how can we, that's the thing that makes me feel hopeless, is how do we affect change with our political system? Because it really has to come from the system.
Well, I'm thinking, just from what we've heard on this panel today from Modisana and Jave and the others, that's part of why artists play such a huge role, because at the end of the day, as we've just heard, artists rarely tell you what the answer is. Artists pose the question in an engaging way that makes you feel what the problem is, but the answer then becomes up to you. And that's an empowering thing. It can be scary too, because you're not being spoon-fed what you should be thinking. But if done well, it might put you on a path to discover your truth and to find others who are like-minded, who are questioning what those lobbyists might be saying. And maybe that's not the only truth out there. Maybe there's something else, and we can build that community and have that dialogue and create a different pathway together.
I want to say that, you know, I agree with what's been said. And Renee, I really appreciate your question on concrete policy change as well. And it makes me think, Melissa, about, you know, what had to happen in order for the program that you lead around prescribing nature to actually, you know, take root and thrive. Because that would signal a kind of political shift, you know, for that kind of program to exist and to be supported.
My mind is kind of going in all sorts of different directions with this conversation. And to your question, Nisha, about how that happened, it really, I think, started with grassroots movement. So when nature prescriptions started taking root in the US, it was small groups of healthcare professionals who thought, I know about these benefits of nature and I really want to connect my patients to them. And when these grassroots movements took root, they grew into larger movements. And so really in Canada, we were inspired by what was happening in the US. And so for this to happen in Canada, not to kind of honk my own horn here, but it really required at least one really dedicated individual who said, this is the vision that I have for the country, a country where people are valuing and connecting to nature for their health. And so it also takes support from an organization like the BC Parks Foundation. As one physician, I couldn't do it myself, but when I had the support of an interdisciplinary team, that really moved things forward. And I think the question, Renee, that you had about how do we make change? How do we get our politicians to pay attention? I think health is a really important part of that. There is research showing that when you frame questions about policy change when it comes to climate change in terms of, say, the economy or health or migration, and if you look at sort of current versus future impacts, it's actually health that sort of across the political spectrum moves people, not like, was mentioned, the images of polar bears. It's when we think about what matters to us personally, our families, ourselves, that's when people move. I think it was David Suzuki who said that he wished that he hadn't focused on all the negative parts, about the climate crisis for so many years, and that he'd focused on solutions. And that's borne out by research too. When we look at opportunity framing versus threat-based framing when it comes to what we can do with climate change, again, that's more appealing to people. So I think if we stay positive, we focus on the solutions, we're realistic about the challenges, but then we move forward as a community. I think that's what will motivate people, and that's also what politicians should respond to as well.
And if I may say something and pose a question, I think from my observation, there's been a lot of rise of anti-intellectualism. There's a lot of ignorance on the rise as well. So the people that care, that's great. But how do we make people that doesn't care? That's the biggest question I have, right? Especially people who doesn't give a damn about arts or about education or about the environment. So that's the hardest people to engage. And what Renee said about the lobbying for politicians, that's also very true, right? So to Melissa's point, I think that I think it's great to make people care on a very personal level. So with the lobbyists, they're usually large corporations, right? So what they care about is bottom line, and how do we equate the environment to the bottom line so that it would really make sense to them, like, oh, hey, maybe we should support the environment because that helps our our bottom dollar, right? So yeah, I think if they can see in such a more direct way with the big picture, then that might actually help people get engaged more. I don't know, but yeah, as Melissa was saying, and we have to engage in a very personal level, be it through the arts or anything else. Say, hey, this is important, take a look. This affects you in this particular way, and then putting in systems that works for them. I think when recycling first started, it was hard to get it off the ground because it wasn't accessible. But now that it's easily accessible, and more people are recycling more, right? So just having that structure in place systematically in our culture, I think is very important to have. So that's just my random 2 cents.
Thank you so much, Jave.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Somebody was about to speak. Modisana.
Yes. Yeah. With me, I think it's about telling relatable stories. What helps me mostly is that because in South Africa, we have so many tribes, and in using indigenous knowledge, because I'm from a tribe of Barolo. Barolo means it's an animal under an antelope family. So as a tribe, we relate with that kind of animal. So using that animal as part of telling a story, it helps to attract my tribe. So we have different tribes, so we're using different animal totems. So in order to engage people, so they come with different individual stories, but they identify with these animals. So as most people know that when you identify with a certain animal, in ancient Africa, you had to protect that animal. So it means all the animals that fall under antelope family, my tribe has to protect those kind of animals. So there are other tribes that identify with a natural environment like rivers and snakes. So those kind of tribes, they have to protect those animals or that natural environment. So coming with that knowledge to say, which tribe do you fall under? Oh, I fall under a tribe of the lions. So now you have this story because your surname is Lion Tau. So now you can relate with the story that we are telling. So if your family falls under a totem of a mountain, so when we tell these collective stories, we identify with animals and natural environments. So that is what brings people together, because they come from different tribes, they come from different families, but in each and every family, there is an animal, there is a plant that they identify with. So that helps us to have collective narratives, and we sort of have relatable stories that when we're saying we have this climate change happening, it is because our rivers are dirty. So there's a tribe that identifies with the river, you know, so those narratives are important to sort of use the existing knowledge within each and every community. We're not imposing knowledge, we're saying, what do you have as a community? What story do you have that relates to nature? What story do you have that relates with this tree, particular tree that we find ourselves in? Tell us that story, and we use that story to say, oh, this is how you relate with this mountain. This is how you relate with this river. This is how you relate with this endangered species. So
I love that. It's not just about convincing someone else that they're wrong or arguing with them. It's about finding the story together.
Yes, it's about finding that story.
And if I may, Modisana, there's an understanding of our relatedness in what you're saying, that we are not living on the earth, we are the earth. We are related to each other, the plants, the animals, the trees. It reminds me of the words of Lubicon Cree woman by the name of Melina Lubicon Massimo, also a fellow of the David Suzuki Foundation, who writes that plants and trees are our relatives. We would be nothing without them. The earth and soil and water give us the privilege to live by renewing our bodies and our breath. It gives us the gift of life each day. We have to ask ourselves, what do we give in return?
Yeah.
And each of you here have offered us a response to that question of what you give in return, which has been incredibly inspiring. And I wonder, Chris, if there's anything that you'd like to add as we bring our conversation to a close, though there's so much more that we could pick up on here.
Oh, there really is. And I would love to talk for another 6 hours, but I'll keep it to very brief. I think where I'm going to jump off from is something that Jave said about attention. And artists and art in all its forms, to some degree, are all about deep listening, deep observation, and shared attention. If artists can bring this crucial life and death issue of the sustainable health of our planet to people's attention in a way that is internalized, where they are hearing deeply, seeing deeply, and then expressing it. That expression can not only help with that ecological anxiety, that environmental anxiety that we've been talking about, but I think even more than that, the community that will build from this global conversation that we in our small ways can help spur, will not just comfort, will not just provide context, will not just build community, but potentially also find ways forward that maybe we haven't considered yet. And at the end of the day, hope is not an escape or a denial of the facts. Hope is taking those facts and imagining a way forward. To some degree, hope is a creative act. So I leave you all with the charge of deep listening, deep observation, pay attention to what is happening now, and find your authentic way of expressing it, and express it to your friends, to your family, to whomever will listen, and you in exchange, listen to them.
Thank you to all of you for being around this table, as it were. We are inspired and called to take this work forward because the challenge continues, and we have more than despair to bring to our efforts. And that is also a message that I just want to elevate and amplify because it really came through in all of your comments today. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Go save the world.